Hello beautiful humans, welcome back to Fixin Rusty Stuff, where I'll fix it till it's broken and then video myself trying to fix it again. I am absolutely clueless, so these videos are purely to add to your entertainment and my own anxiety. Well, I'm sure all 45 of you are on the edge of your seats wondering if the shed cave has finally collapsed into a pile of ready-made firewood, or if by some miracle it's still standing. Well, against all odds, it's managed to cling to life and has in fact limped slightly nearer to completion. In this episode, we will be observing the installation of the cladding. So, like Hunter Biden with a swimming pool full of cocaine, let's jump into it. If you can reminisce with me for a moment about the pile of old shed that I dismantled back in episode 1, link in the description of course, you will know that the walls were made entirely of cladding nailed onto battens. This is what constituted the shed structure. I use the term structure loosely as it seemed to have all the structural integrity of a politician's promise. A well-placed dropkick would have probably turned the whole thing into a stack of wooden pancakes. Nevertheless, as you can see here, the cladding is entirely devoid of rot. And while it has probably been standing for as long as I have, unlike me, it's still usable and, for its age, in relatively good condition. Now, there's not quite enough of this antique cladding to do the whole exterior, but I should be able to salvage enough for at least 2 sides. So I'll use it to clad the 2 sides that I don't have to look at and donate that glorious eyesore to my neighbours instead. I'll put my hand in my pocket and buy new cladding for the sides facing into my garden and just pretend it looks like that from all angles. So I bravely ventured into this chaotic pile, dug out the old shed walls and started prying the cladding away from the battens that held them together. Now, if you've been following the saga of my incompetence over the last 5 or 6 videos, you'll know that the space between my neighbour's yard and my shed wall is about as wide as a circuit trace on a PCB. Consequently, you got more chance of Keir Starmer hosting a free speech rally than screwing the battens on from that side. This calls for some creative thinking, or, more accurately, creative bodging. Instead of the traditional, and when I say traditional I mean correct way, of screwing the battens onto the walls and then nailing the cladding to the battens by using these beautiful 40mm annular ring shank nails, I built the majority of the panel on the ground and then screwed both the cladding and the battens into the wall studs in one incorrect, misguided, foul swoop. Well, when life gives you lemons, make shed cave lemonade. When reconfiguring the cladding panels, I had to ensure that the battens would land on a wall stud, as only screwing it into the ply would ensure that the cladding stayed up as about as long as an 8-year-old who's lost his Viagra. Once a panel was built, I gave it a clean up and a couple of coats of my new favourite colour. I believe it's called English Summer Grey for those that are interested. Not gonna lie, I was quite impressed with how well it cleaned up. So with a mix of determination and a healthy disregard for my neighbour's opinion, I then hoisted the panel into their garden and proceeded to secure it onto the side of the shed. As mentioned before, luckily they were on holiday, so there was no laughing or quiet disappointment at my incompetence. As my neighbour's fence tops out at about 1.8 metres, I nailed the rest of the cladding onto the battens in the normal way. The cladding from the old shed walls was shorter than a mouse's pube, so I had to install them in 2 sections. I'll slap a trim piece over the join and cross my fingers it keeps the rain out. I like to call that the pray and hope method. I'm not exactly proud of what came next. Laziness kicked in when I noticed the battens on the next panel lined up perfectly with the wall studs. So in a moment of questionable judgment, I continued with my incorrect method of screwing the entire panel directly onto the side. After that, I figured it was time to start doing things correctly. Now, when I say correctly, I should clarify here. I didn't even bother watching 10 seconds of a YouTube how-to video, so it's almost certainly still entirely incorrect, just less catastrophically wrong than my earlier attempts. First, I measured and cut the battens. I then drilled holes for the screws, and I screwed the battens through the ply into the wall studs at what can only be described as strategically random intervals. I added some extra battens around the windows and doors for good measure. Next, I hammered the cladding onto the battens, doing my best to line it up with the cladding on the other sides. I continued this fine art of guesswork until the whole shed was wrapped up in a beautiful layer of redwood. And by beautiful, I mean a bit like a Jason Pollock painting. Chaotic yet oddly satisfying. And now, time for a very brief intermission and a video of some technicians testing out an automated security drone.
Like a bigger one though.
Yeah, it's going to work. Yeah, I think going into that would be someone in front of the computer every single day.
Back to the man cave. Once the cladding was up, I slapped on a generous coat of Ronsil shed and fence mistake hider and took a step back to revel at the sight of my glorious grey monolith in all its incorrectly built glory. I'm not sure if I mentioned this before, but I am just a geezer pretending he can do DIY. I also threw on some corner trim to hide the hideous joins of my amateur carpentry. Think of it as putting lipstick on a pig. Now, I determined that I needed some ventilation in this, considering the high probability of the occasional electrical fire and the regular smoke from the friction of blunt circular saw blades grinding against smouldering wood. I drilled a massive hole for a fan vent in the back. Safety first after all. Now, while all the battle-hardened chippies are probably shouting obscenities at their screens at my childlike ineptitude when it comes to man caving, I am relatively astonished that A, I've made it this far without losing any digits, and B, that I seem to have accomplished erecting a relatively watertight structure. So in that vein, let's take a little tour of the exterior of the shed cave this far. Bloody hell, maybe I overdid the grey a bit on this one. Now that's pretty much it for this episode, so let's dive straight into this week's run-based errors. My moment of laziness came back to bite me here, because if I'd done things the correct way, the cladding on the back would line up nicely, just like the rest of the shed walls. But as it stands, this mismatched line of cladding will haunt my dreams for eternity. Watching me build this shed is like watching a car crash in slow motion, but with more sawdust and fewer airbags. For run-based error number 2, I should have ensured that either the corner trim was wider, or ideally, that my errors were less severe. Because as you can see here, I'm going to have a bodging brainstorm session to figure out how to cover these redonkulous gaps. If you got any bright ideas, let me know in the comments, preferably without swear words or pointing out the obvious fact that I'm clearly a clueless wacker. For run-based error number 3, I really should have sanded down this panel, as it just hasn't got the same beautiful finish as the new plywood. While it is in good condition, it's just had too many layers of paint to look new. Of course, these will go on the infamous and infinite snag list, which I will get to at a later date, assuming I don't meet my end in a tragic bodge-related accident before then. If you can spot any other run-based errors, and I'm sure you can, feel free to jot them down, put them in an envelope, and mail them to literally anywhere but here, because to be honest, I'm running out of paper for my snag list. In the next episode, I may take a break from my wood-based escapades and try something a little more palatable and a lot more dangerous and start pissing around with some electricity. I'm sure you won't want to miss that one. Well, lovely people, that brings us to the end of the episode. Thanks for enjoying the debacles. If you found any of that in the slightest bit entertaining, weld that like button down, subscribe to the channel, share it with your favourite granny, and stay tuned for the next episode of Fixin Rusty.